Picture this, it's 1966 and NASCAR officials are crawling all over a Chevrolet Chevelle in the inspection bay at Daytona. They're measuring everything, wheelbase, engine displacement, and most importantly, the fuel tank. They drain it completely, then refill it with exactly 22 gallons of racing fuel. The measurement is perfect. Regulation size. The inspector slaps his approval on the tech sheet and waves the car through. What he doesn't know is that he's just been fooled by a basketball. This is the story of Smokey Yunick, the greatest cheater NASCAR never caught. Well, almost never caught. The man who turned rule bending into an art form and made NASCAR officials question their own sanity. A mechanical genius who once said, "If you ain't cheating, you ain't trying." And brother, Smokey was trying harder than anyone, but here's where it gets interesting. While other teams were hiding nitrous bottles or shaving weight, Smokey was playing three-dimensional chess with a Wilson basketball and the laws of physics. The basketball trick wasn't just clever, it was so stupidly simple that when NASCAR finally figured it out, they couldn't believe they'd been fooled for months. To understand how a grown man with a basketball humiliated NASCAR's entire inspection process, we need to travel back to the Wild West days of stock car racing. The 1960s, when the rulebook was more of a suggestion and creative interpretation was part of the game. NASCAR was trying to keep competition fair by limiting fuel tank capacity to 22 gallons. Same amount of fuel for everyone meant races came down to driver skill and fuel strategy, not who had the biggest tank. The France family, who ran NASCAR, had instituted increasingly strict inspection procedures. By 1966, tech inspection had become a serious affair. Officials would drain tanks completely, measure them with calibrated fuel dispensers, check capacity with graduated cylinders. They thought they had every angle covered. They hadn't met Smokey Yunick yet. See, Smokey wasn't just some grease monkey with a clever idea. This was a man who'd been a B-17 bomber mechanic in World War II who'd modified aircraft engines to fly higher and faster than the Germans thought possible. After the war, he opened the best damn garage in town in Daytona Beach, and he meant it. Smokey had already become infamous for other innovations, like the time he showed up with a 7/8 scale Chevelle that was perfectly proportioned but smaller in every dimension, giving him a massive aerodynamic advantage. NASCAR had to write a whole new rule just for that one. But the fuel tank situation was different. NASCAR knew everyone was trying to cheat on fuel capacity. More fuel meant fewer pit stops. Fewer pit stops meant better track position. Better track position meant winning races. The math was simple, that's why they inspected fuel systems so carefully. They'd stick measuring tapes inside, use dipsticks, fill, and drain tanks multiple times. They were absolutely certain they had this covered. The problem Smokey faced was elegant in its simplicity. How do you make a 22-gallon tank hold 27 or 28 gallons without NASCAR noticing? You can't make the tank physically larger. They measure the dimensions. You can't have hidden compartments. They check for those. You can't run extra fuel lines. They inspect the entire fuel system. So what do? Here's where Smokey's genius kicked in. He realized NASCAR was measuring the tank's capacity by filling it with fuel. But what if the tank wasn't actually empty when they started filling it? What if something was already taking up space inside one, something that could be removed after inspection? Enter the basketball. The execution was beautiful in its simplicity. Smokey would take a standard basketball and inflate it to about 3/4 full. Not completely inflated, that would make it too rigid. Just enough to make it roughly spherical and displace about 5 to 6 gallons worth of volume. He'd carefully insert it into the oversized fuel tank through the filler neck, positioning it so it wouldn't interfere with the fuel pickup or sending unit. The fuel tank itself was built to hold around 27 or 28 gallons, but with the basketball inside, it would only accept 22 gallons of fuel. When NASCAR inspectors came calling, they'd drain whatever fuel was in there, then refill it. The fuel would flow around the basketball, filling the available space. 22 gallons. Perfect. Regulation size. Stamp of approval. After passing inspection, Smokey's crew would wait until the officials moved on to inspect other cars. Then came the magic trick. They'd snake a thin rod with a needle tip through the filler neck, puncture the basketball, and pull out the deflated rubber through the opening. Sometimes they'd use a vacuum pump to help extract it. The whole operation took maybe 3 minutes. Suddenly, that 22-gallon tank could hold 27 or 28 gallons. That's 5 to 6 extra gallons of Sunoco 260 racing fuel. At roughly 6 pounds per gallon, we're talking about 30 to 36 extra pounds of fuel. Now that might seem like a weight penalty, but here's the thing about fuel strategy in 1960s NASCAR. You burned it off. That extra weight disappeared as you raced, but the advantage of staying on track while others pitted, that was permanent. Let me put that in perspective. A stock car in 1966 got maybe 4 to 5 miles per gallon under race conditions. Those extra 5 gallons meant 20 to 25 additional miles between pit stops. At Daytona, running 180 miles per hour, that's over 8 minutes of racing. 8 minutes where you're on track and your competition is sitting still in the pits. In a 500-mile race, that could mean one fewer pit stop entirely. The technical brilliance went beyond just the basketball. Smokey had to engineer the fuel tank itself to accommodate this trick. The tank was constructed from 22-gauge steel with internal baffles to prevent fuel slosh. But Smokey's version had carefully placed baffles that would still function properly with or without the basketball in place. The fuel pickup was positioned to work regardless of whether the basketball was present. The venting system had to handle the different fuel levels without causing problems. He also had to consider thermal expansion. Racing fuel heats up during a race, expanding in volume. A basketball filled with air would also expand when heated. Too much expansion in the basketball could interfere with fuel flow or even damage the tank. Smokey calculated the exact inflation pressure needed to maintain the right displacement while allowing for heat expansion. But wait, there's more. Smokey didn't stop at just the basketball trick. He was running what he called a thermos tank, a fuel tank with a double wall and insulation between the walls. This kept the fuel cooler, which meant it was denser. Denser fuel means more energy per gallon. While everyone else's fuel was heating up and expanding, Smokey stayed cool and compact. Combined with the basketball trick, he was getting maybe 15 to 20% more range than anyone else. The basketball scheme ran for most of the 1966 season. Race after race, Smokey's cars would somehow stretch their fuel mileage beyond what seemed physically possible. Other crew chiefs were pulling their hair out. They knew Smokey was up to something. His cars would run 1 or 2 fewer pit stops than everyone else with identical engines, but nobody could figure out how. NASCAR inspectors were going crazy. They measured everything multiple times. They'd drain Smokey's tank, measure the fuel that came out, then refill it and measure what went in. 22 gallons every time. They checked for hidden tanks, auxiliary fuel cells, secret fuel lines running through the frame rails. Nothing. They even made Smokey run his car on a dynamometer to verify fuel consumption rates. Everything checked out. The other teams started getting desperate. Junior Johnson, another legendary NASCAR figure, supposedly offered one of Smokey's crew members $500, serious money in 1966, to reveal the secret. The crew member kept quiet. Smokey inspired that kind of loyalty. Some teams tried to replicate whatever Smokey was doing. They experimented with fuel additives, different tank shapes, even early versions of fuel cells. Nothing matched Smokey's advantage. One crew chief, Herb Knabb, famously said, "That son of a bitch has got a garden hose running from the grandstands to his fuel tank. I just can't find it." The psychological effect on the competition was devastating. Imagine you're a driver. You've calculated your fuel strategy perfectly. You know exactly when you need to pit. Then, you watch Smokey's car blow past the pit entrance when you're coming in for fuel. You do the math in your head, and it doesn't add up. It's not possible. But there it is, lap after lap, that black and gold Chevelle still circulating while you're stuck on pit road. But here's the kicker. The basketball wasn't Smokey's only fuel trick that season. He was also running 2-inch diameter fuel lines instead of the standard 1.5-inch lines. Doesn't sound like much, but it meant fuel flowed into his tank faster during pit stops. While everyone else was taking 20 seconds to get 22 gallons in, Smokey was getting his 27 gallons in about the same time. NASCAR never caught that one either. So what was actually going wrong with NASCAR's inspection process? The fundamental flaw was assuming the tank was empty when they started measuring. They drained the tank, but the basketball was already in there, taking up space. It was like measuring the capacity of a swimming pool with a Volkswagen at the bottom. You're only measuring the water, not the total volume. The inspectors were also victims of their own consistency. They had a routine: drain, measure, fill, measure again. Smokey knew this routine. He could predict exactly what they check and when they check it. He once said, NASCAR inspectors are like cops. They get lazy. They check the same things the same way every time. All you gotta do is find the thing they ain't checking. Think about that for a second. This wasn't high-tech cheating. This wasn't computer-controlled traction management or exotic metallurgy. This was a man with a basketball and an understanding of volume displacement. It was so simple that when NASCAR finally figured it out, one inspector reportedly said, "A goddamn basketball. Are you kidding me?" The discovery came, as these things often do, by accident. The story goes that during a particularly rough inspection after a race at Atlanta, an inspector noticed something odd about the fuel filler neck on Smokey's car. There were scratches on the inside, like something had been repeatedly pushed through. They decided to completely remove the fuel tank for inspection, something they rarely did because it took hours. When they cut open the tank, they found rubber residue inside. Not a basketball that had already been removed, but tiny fragments of rubber stuck to the baffles. Chemical analysis showed it was consistent with basketball material. They'd found the smoking gun, or in this case, the deflated basketball. NASCAR's reaction was swift and severe. They immediately banned any foreign objects in fuel tanks during inspection. They instituted new procedures requiring tanks to be inspected with cameras or borescopes. They started doing random post-race tank removals. The new rule specifically stated no devices, materials, or substances designed to alter the measured capacity of the fuel cell shall be permitted. They literally had to write a rule about basketballs. But here's the thing about Smokey Yunick. He didn't see this as a defeat. When confronted with the evidence, he reportedly grinned and said, "Took you long enough." Then he asked if they wanted to know about the 11 other illegal modifications on the car. When they said yes, he pointed to the car driving away and said, "Make that 12. The car didn't have a fuel tank installed. He was driving it on a temporary tank hidden in the frame. The immediate impact on Smokey's racing program was significant. Without the fuel advantage, his cars had to pit more often. But Smokey being Smokey, he'd already moved on to other innovations. Within weeks, he was experimenting with roof height modifications that were technically legal, but gave an aerodynamic advantage. When NASCAR banned those, he moved on to something else. It was an endless game of cat and mouse. The basketball incident became legendary in NASCAR circles. It represented everything about the sport's early days: the creativity, the bending of rules, the constant battle between innovation and regulation. Other crew chiefs started sharing their own Smokey stories, like the time he built a fuel line that was 2 inches in diameter but looked like a standard 1-inch line from the outside. Or when he acid dipped an entire car body to remove weight, then painted it to look like standard thickness metal. The broader impact on NASCAR was profound. The organization realized they needed more sophisticated inspection procedures. They started hiring former crew chiefs and engineers as inspectors, people who could think like cheaters to catch cheaters. They invested in better measurement equipment, established more detailed rulebooks, and created an appeals process for disputed violations. But they also recognized something important. The creativity and innovation that led to tricks like the basketball were the same forces that made racing exciting. Too many rules would stifle the sport. They needed to find a balance between fair competition and allowing room for innovation. Smokey's basketball had taught them that lesson. Modern NASCAR inspection makes Smokey's era look like the Stone Age. Today's Cup Series cars go through optical scanning systems that measure every surface to within thousandths of an inch. Fuel cells are spec parts provided by approved manufacturers. There are radio frequency identification tags on major components. The inspection process uses laser measurement systems, computer modeling, and metallurgical analysis. The fuel systems in particular have evolved dramatically. Modern NASCAR fuel cells are made by companies like FuelSafe and ATL. They're not just tanks, they're complex systems with foam baffling to prevent explosion, check valves to prevent spillage in crashes, and electronic monitoring systems that track fuel flow in real time. The capacity is strictly controlled at 18.5 gallons for superspeedway races, with overflow containers that must return excess fuel to the primary cell. But here's what's fascinating. Even with all this technology, teams still try to push boundaries. In 2022, NASCAR issued penalties for teams manipulating wheel well templates. In 2023, they caught teams using modified underwing strakes for aerodynamic advantage. The spirit of Smokey Yunick lives on. It just requires more sophisticated approaches. The cost of modern cheating has escalated too. When Smokey got caught with his basketball, he might have lost some points or paid a small fine. Today, violations can result in suspensions worth millions in lost prize money, sponsors pulling support, and crew chiefs being banned from the sport. The stakes are infinitely higher. But let's return to Smokey for a moment. What made him special wasn't just the basketball trick or any single innovation. It was his approach to the entire concept of rules. He once famously said, "All those other guys were cheating. I was just interpreting the rules creatively." He read every rule, looking for what it didn't say rather than what it did. If the rule said the fuel tank had to hold 22 gallons, well, it did hold 22 gallons when the basketball was in it. This philosophy extended beyond just fuel tanks. Smokey would argue that if NASCAR wanted something done a specific way, they should write a specific rule. Vague rules were invitations to innovate. He wasn't breaking rules. He was exploring their boundaries. This forced NASCAR to become better at writing regulations, to think through implications, to consider how someone might interpret their words differently than intended. The human side of this story is equally compelling. Smokey Yunick wasn't some corporate-backed operation with unlimited resources. He was an independent operator, often racing against factory teams with 10 times his budget. The basketball trick and others like it were how he leveled the playing field. David versus Goliath, except David had a basketball and a brilliant understanding of physics. His crew members from that era still tell stories about working for Smokey. He demanded perfection but inspired incredible loyalty. He'd spend hours explaining the engineering behind his modifications, teaching his guys not just what to do, but why it worked. Many went on to become crew chiefs themselves, carrying forward Smokey's innovative spirit. One former crew member, who asked not to be named, told me about the night they first installed the basketball system. Smokey had us practice over and over, inserting the basketball, positioning it correctly, then removing it quickly. We must have done it 100 times until we could do it in under 3 minutes in the dark. He said, "Boys, if you're going to cheat, be professional about it." The drivers who raced Smokey's cars had mixed feelings about his modifications. On one hand, they loved the competitive advantage. On the other, they were the ones who'd face a NASCAR's wrath if caught. Fireball Roberts, who drove for Smokey, once said, "I never asked what Smokey did to the car. I figured if I didn't know, I couldn't accidentally tell anyone." But the real story wasn't just the basketball. It was what the basketball represented. This was guerrilla warfare against the establishment. Smokey was the underdog using his wits to compete against factory millions. Every trick was a middle finger to the France family and their attempts to control racing. It was American ingenuity at its finest, or worst, depending on your perspective. The basketball trick also highlighted a fundamental tension in motorsports that exists to this day. Racing is supposed to be about the best driver in equal equipment, but it's also about innovation, engineering excellence, and pushing boundaries. Where do you draw the line? Smokey's basketball forced NASCAR to confront that question. From a purely engineering standpoint, the basketball trick was elegant. It required no special tools, no exotic materials, no complex modifications. It was reversible, reliable, and virtually undetectable. It worked within the laws of physics while skirting the laws of NASCAR. It was in many ways the perfect cheat. The thermodynamics involved were more complex than they might appear. The basketball had to maintain its shape under varying temperatures and pressures. Too soft and it wouldn't displace enough fuel. Too hard and it might not compress enough to remove easily. Smokey had to calculate the ideal gas law equations to determine the exact pressure needed at different ambient temperatures. He also had to consider the chemical compatibility. Racing fuel in the 1960s contained lead additives and other chemicals that could degrade rubber. The basketball had to survive multiple races without deteriorating. Smokey tested different basketball brands to find the one with the most chemical-resistant rubber compound. The removal process was equally clever. The needle used to puncture the basketball was specially designed, sharp enough to pierce the rubber, but not so long that it might damage the tank walls. The extraction tool was a modified plumber's snake with a grabbing attachment that could grip the deflated basketball and pull it through the filler neck without tearing. Let's talk about what 5 to 6 extra gallons really meant in strategic terms. In a 500-mile race at Daytona, cars would typically pit every 50 to 60 miles for fuel. That's 8 to 10 pit stops. With Smokey's extra capacity, his cars could run 70 to 75 miles between stops. That's only 6 to 7 stops. Each pit stop in 1966 took about 30 to 45 seconds. Saving 2 or 3 stops meant gaining 60 to 135 seconds over the race. In racing, that's an eternity, but the advantage went beyond just time saved. Track position in NASCAR is everything. Every time competitors pitted and Smokey's car didn't, it gained positions. This put his drivers in cleaner air, away from traffic, able to run faster laps. The psychological advantage was huge. Competitors would overdrive their cars trying to keep up, wearing out tires and engines faster. The financial implications were significant too. Winning races meant prize money, but more importantly, it meant sponsorship deals. Success attracted sponsors, and sponsors brought money for better equipment, better engines, better everything. Smokey's basketball wasn't just helping win races, it was funding future innovations. When news of the basketball trick finally became public, the reaction from fans was fascinating. Instead of outrage, there was admiration. NASCAR fans loved the outlaw spirit, the clever David versus Goliath angle. Smokey became even more of a folk hero. Sales of basketballs reportedly spiked in Daytona Beach as fans bought them as souvenirs. The media coverage was extensive. Sports Illustrated ran a feature on Smokey's innovations. Hot Rod magazine did a technical analysis of how the trick worked. Even mainstream newspapers covered it, often with a tone of bemused admiration. The Charlotte Observer wrote, "In a sport built on speed and daring, Yunick added brains to the equation." Other racing series took notice too. IndyCar, IMSA, and even Formula One tightened their fuel cell inspection procedures. The FIA issued a technical bulletin specifically addressing void-creating devices in fuel systems. Smokey's basketball had influenced global motorsport regulation, but here's what many people don't know. The basketball wasn't Smokey's most audacious fuel-related trick. He once showed up at inspection with a car that had its fuel line routed through the frame rails. The rule said fuel line diameter couldn't exceed 1 inch. They said nothing about length. Smokey's fuel line was 11 feet long and held nearly 5 gallons of fuel by itself. When inspectors checked the tank capacity, they didn't account for the fuel in the line. Another time, he built a car with offset frame rails that created a cavity he filled with fuel. Technically, it wasn't a separate fuel tank. It was part of the chassis structure that happened to hold gasoline. NASCAR had to rewrite the definition of what constituted a fuel container. The legacy of the basketball trick extends far beyond racing. It's taught in engineering schools as an example of creative problem solving. Business schools use it as a case study in competitive advantage through innovation. It's become a metaphor for thinking outside the box, or in this case, thinking about what's inside the box. Modern NASCAR teams still study Smokey's innovations, not to copy them, they wouldn't work today, but to understand the mindset. How do you look at a rule and see not a limitation, but an opportunity? How do you find advantages where others see restrictions? That's the real lesson of the basketball. Smokey continued innovating until his death in 2001. In his later years, he developed improved cylinder heads for small block Chevrolets, created a reverse flow cooling system that improved engine efficiency, and even designed a hot vapor engine that ran on heated gasoline fumes. He held 9 U.S. patents and influenced countless others. When asked about the basketball trick near the end of his life, Smokey showed no remorse. "NASCAR needed me," he said. "I kept them. Honest. Every time I found a new way around their rules, they got better at writing rules. I made the sport better by making them work harder." The basketball itself, or at least one claiming to be the original, now sits in the International Motorsports Hall of Fame. It's displayed alongside Smokey's tools and other innovations. Thousands of fans see it every year, most shaking their heads in amazement that something so simple fooled so many for so long. Current NASCAR Cup Series crew chief Chad Knaus, who's been called the modern Smokey Yunick, once said, "Smokey taught us all that innovation isn't about having the most resources. It's about seeing opportunities others miss. The basketball trick wasn't about the basketball. It was about understanding the inspection process better than the inspectors did. The philosophical question Smokey's basketball raises is profound. In any competitive endeavor, rules exist to create fairness. But rules also create boundaries, and boundaries invite exploration. Is pushing those boundaries cheating? Or is it the natural evolution of competition? Smokey would argue he was just better at reading the rulebook than anyone else. Think about modern parallels. Tech companies exploit tax loopholes. Athletes use every legal supplement right up to the banned substance list. Financial traders find microsecond advantages in high-frequency trading. The spirit of Smokey's basketball lives on wherever smart people push systems to their absolute limits. The basketball trick also demonstrates the importance of simplicity and innovation. In an era when teams were exploring complex mechanical solutions, exotic fuels, and elaborate schemes, Smokey won with elementary school physics and sporting goods equipment. Sometimes, the best solution is the simplest one nobody else thought of. From a pure engineering perspective, what Smokey did was optimize a system within artificial constraints. The constraint was 22 gallons as measured by NASCAR's method. The optimization was maximizing actual fuel capacity while meeting that measured constraint. It's the same problem-solving approach used in everything from architecture to software development. The story also highlights how regulation and innovation dance together in technological progress. NASCAR's rules drove Smokey's creativity. Smokey's creativity drove better NASCAR rules. This cycle of measure and countermeasure advanced the sport technically and competitively. Without cheaters like Smokey, NASCAR might have stagnated. But let's not romanticize it too much. Smokey's tricks did create unfair advantages. Competitors who followed the rules were at a disadvantage. Sponsors invested in teams thinking the playing field was level. There were real victims of Smokey's creativity, even if we admire the innovation. The final race where Smokey used the basketball trick was supposedly Charlotte in October 1966. By then, NASCAR was getting suspicious. They'd assigned an inspector specifically to watch Smokey's crew. The basketball was removed as usual, but the inspector noticed crew members carrying something to a truck. He didn't pursue it then, but it planted the seed that led to the discovery. After NASCAR banned the basketball trick, Smokey supposedly said, "Well, it was fun while it lasted." Then he walked over to his car, pointed at the rear window, and said, "Notice anything different about that?" The rear window was a half-inch taller than stock, creating better aerodynamics. While NASCAR was focused on the fuel tank, Smokey had already moved on to the next innovation. This cat-and-mouse game defined NASCAR's golden era. It wasn't just about who had the fastest car or the best driver. It was about who could outsmart the system. Who could find advantages in the gray areas of the rulebook? Who could innovate faster than regulators could regulate? The basketball trick remains the perfect example of this era. It was brilliant, simple, effective, and just believable enough that when people hear about it, they think, "Why didn't I think of that?" That's the mark of true innovation. It seems obvious in retrospect. Today's NASCAR is a different animal. The cars are essentially spec racers with minimal room for innovation. Every part is monitored, measured, and controlled. The spirit of competition has shifted from engineering innovation to perfect execution of known parameters. Some say this makes for better racing. Others miss the Wild West days of Smokey's basketball. But innovation finds a way. Teams now focus on simulation, data analysis, and incremental improvements within tight tolerances. They might not be hiding basketballs in fuel tanks, but they're finding advantages in algorithmic pit stop strategies and aerodynamic details measured in millimeters. The game continues, just with different rules. Smokey Yunick's basketball trick wasn't just about cheating NASCAR inspectors. It was about the relentless pursuit of competitive advantage. It was about seeing rules not as absolute barriers, but as puzzles to be solved. It was about using wit and wisdom to compete against wealth and resources. Most importantly, it was about the pure joy of outsmarting the system. When Smokey watched those inspectors measure his tank and find exactly 22 gallons, he must have felt the satisfaction that comes from perfect execution of a brilliant idea. That moment when the inspector stamped approval on a tank hiding a basketball, that was Smokey's real victory. The story reminds us that innovation often comes from constraints. If NASCAR had no rules, there would have been no need for the basketball trick. The rules created the puzzle, and Smokey loved puzzles. Every regulation was a challenge, every restriction an invitation to innovate. In the end, the basketball wasn't just about fuel capacity, it was about the human spirit that refuses to accept limitations. It was about American ingenuity and the garage inventor taking on the establishment. It was about finding joy in the clever solution, the elegant workaround, the simple trick that nobody else saw coming. Smokey Yunick passed away in 2001, but his legacy lives on. Every time a race team finds a creative interpretation of the rules. Every time an engineer solves a problem with elegant simplicity. Every time David finds a way to compete with Goliath using nothing but ingenuity and a basketball. The next time you watch a NASCAR race, remember that somewhere in that garage area, someone is looking at the rulebook the way Smokey did, not reading what it says, but understanding what it doesn't say. They might not have a basketball, but they have the same spirit, the relentless pursuit of speed through innovation. And that's the real lesson of Smokey's basketball. In racing, as in life, the biggest advantages often come from the simplest ideas. You don't need complex technology or unlimited resources. Sometimes all you need is a different way of looking at the problem, and maybe a basketball. What's the most creative rule bending you've ever witnessed in any sport or competition? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your stories of innovation and ingenuity. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into NASCAR's wildest era, hit that subscribe button for more legendary stories of automotive innovation. Until next time, keep pushing boundaries, just maybe not with basketballs and fuel tanks.